So this is Lord of the Flies on chapter 1, The Sound of Shell. So the boy with the fair hair lowered himself down towards the last feet of rock and began to pick his way towards the lagoon. Although he had taken off his school sweater and trailed it now from one hand, his gray shirt stuck to him and his hair was plastered to his forehead. All around him, the lawn scar smashed into the jungle with a bath of heat. He was clambering heavily into the jungle. He was clambering heavily among the creepers and the broken trunks when a bird, a vision of red and yellow, flashed upwards with a witch-like cry, and this cry was echoed by another. Hi, it said. Wait a minute. The undergrowth at the side of the scar was shaken, and a multitude of raindrops fell pattering. Wait a minute, the voice said. I got caught up. The fair boy had stopped and jerked his stockings with an automatic gesture that made the jungle seem, for a moment, like the old country, like the home countries. The voice spoke again. I can hardly move with all these creeper things. The owner of the voice came backing out of the undergrowth so that the twigs scratched on the greasy windbreaker. The naked crooks of his knees were plump, caught and scratched by thorns. He bent down, removed the thorns carefully, and turned around. He was shorter than the fair boy and very fat. And these are going to be two of our primary characters. He came forward, searching out the safe lodgements from his feet, and then looked through thick spectacles. Where's the man with the megaphone? The fair boy shook his head. This is an island. At least I think it's an island. There's a reef out in the sea. Perhaps there aren't any grown-ups anywhere. And the fat boy looked startled. There was that pilot, but he wasn't in the passenger tube. He was in the cabin, he was up in the cabin in front. The fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. All them other kids, the fat boy went on. Some of them must have gone out. They must have, haven't they? And the fair boy was peering at the reef through screwed-up eyes. And the fair boy began to pick his way as casually as possible towards the water. He tried to be offhand and not too obviously uninterested, but the fat boy hurried after him. Aren't there any grown-ups at all? I don't think so. The fair boy said this solemnly, but then the delight and realized ambition overcame him. In the middle of the scar, he stood on his head and grinned at the reversed fat boy. No grown-ups, the fat boy thought for a moment. That pilot. The fair boy had allowed his feet to come down and sat on the steamy earth. He must have flown off after he dropped us. He couldn't land here, not in a plane with wheels. We was attacked, which means shot down. He'll be back, all right. The fat boy shook his head. When we was coming down, I looked through one of them windows and I saw the other part of the plane. There were flames coming out of it. He looked up and down the scar. And this is what the tube done. The fair boy reached out and touched the jagged end of a trunk. For a moment, he looked interested. What happened to it, he asked. Where's it got to now? The storm dragged it out to sea. It wasn't half dangerous with all them tree trunks fallen. There must have been some kids still in it. He hesitated for a moment and then spoke again. What's your name? Ralph. So Ralph is the tall fair boy. The fat boy wanted to ask his name in turn, but this proffer of acquaintance was not made. The fair boy called Ralph, smiled vaguely, stood up, and began to make his way once more towards the lagoon. The fat boy hung steadily at his shoulder. I expect there's a lot more of us scattered about. You haven't seen any others, have you? Ralph shook his head and increased his speed. Then he tripped over a branch and came down with a crash. And the fat boy stood by him, breathing hard. My auntie told me not to run, he explained, on account of my asthma. Asthma? That's right. Can't catch me breath. I was the only boy in our school who had asthma, said the fat boy with a touch of pride. I've been wearing specs since I was 3. Now, obviously, today, asthma is very common. When this was published in 1954, asthma was much more rare. He took off his glasses and held them out to Ralph, blinking and smiling, and then started to wipe them against his grubby windbreaker. An expression of pain and inward concentration altered the pale contours of his face. He smeared the sweat from his cheeks and quickly adjusted the spectacles on his nose. Them fruit. He glanced around the scar. Them fruit, he said. I expect. He put on his glasses, waited away from Ralph, and then crouched down among the tangled foliage. I'll be out again in just a minute. Ralph disentangled himself cautiously and then stole away through the branches. In a few seconds, the fat boy's grunts were behind him, and he was hurrying towards the screen that still lay between him and the lagoon. He climbed over a broken trunk, and that was and was out of the jungle. The shore was fledged with palm trees. These stood or leaned or reclined against the light, and their green feathers were 100 feet up in the air. The ground beneath them was a bank covered in coarse grass, torn everywhere by the upheavals of fallen trees, scattered with the decaying coconuts and the palm saplings. Behind this was the darkness of the forest proper and the open space of the scar. Ralph stood, one hand against a gray trunk, and screwed up his eyes against the shimmering water. Out there, perhaps a mile away, the white surf flanked on a coral reef, and beyond that, the open sea was a dark blue. With the irregular arc of coral, the lagoon was still as a mountain lake, blue of all shades, and shadowy green and purple. The beach between the palm terrace and the water was a thin bow stave, endless apparently. For to Ralph's left, the perspective of palm and beach and water drew to a point at infinity, and always almost invisible was the heat. So the author describes the islands in intense detail, and we're going to see this a lot. It's almost to the point where it's too much. As a quick summary, they landed on your stereotypical really hot coconut tree island. It's very hot. It's very beautiful. Lots of vivid colors. There's a coral reef, etc. So back to the book here. He jumped down from the terrace, and the sand was thick over his black shoes, and the heat hit him. He became conscious of the weight of his clothes, kicked his shoes off fiercely, and ripped off each stocking with its elastic garter in a signal movement. Then he leapt back on the terrace, pulled off his shirt, and stood there among the skull-like coconuts with green shadows from the palms and the forest sliding over his skin. He undid the skin clasp of his belt, lugged off his shorts and pants, and then stood there naked, looking at the dazzling beach and the water. He was old enough, 12 years and a few months, to have lost the prominent tummy of his childhood, and not yet old enough for adolescence to make him awkward. You could see now that he might have been a boxer, as far as width and heaviness of the shoulders went, but there was a mildness about his mouth and eyes that proclaimed no devil. He patted the palm trunk softly and, forced at last to believe in the reality of the island, laughed delightedly again and stood on his head. He turned neatly onto his feet, jumped down to the beach, knelt, and swept a double armful of sand into a pile against his chest. Then he sat back and looked at the water with bright, excited eyes. So Ralph, the fair boy, is very excited to be on this island, right? And he mentioned previously there's no adults, so he's happy about this. Ralph, the fat boy, lowered himself on the terrace and sat down carefully, using the edge as a seat. I'm sorry I've been such a time. Then fruit. He wiped his glasses and adjusted them on his button nose. The frame had made a deep pink V on the bridge. He looked down critically at Ralph's golden body, and then down at his own clothes. He laid a hand on the end of a zipper that extended down his chest. My auntie. Then he opened the zipper with precision and pulled the whole windbreaker over his head. There. Ralph looked at him sidelong and said nothing. I expect we'll want to know all their names, said the fat boy, and make a list. We ought to have a meeting. Ralph did not take the hint, so the fat boy was forced to continue. I don't care what they call me, he said confidently, so long as they don't call me what they used to call me at school. So this is the fat boy still. We don't know his name yet. Ralph was faintly interested. What was that? The fat boy glanced over his shoulder and then leaned towards Ralph. He whispered, they used to call me Piggy. Piggy because he's a fat, short boy. Ralph shrieked with laughter. He jumped up. Piggy, Piggy. Ralph, please. Piggy clasped his hands in apprehension. I said I didn't want. Piggy, Piggy. Ralph danced out into the hot air of the beach and then returned as the fighter plane, with wind swept back and machine gun to Piggy. He dived in at the sand at Piggy's feet and lay there laughing. Piggy. Piggy grinned reluctantly, pleased despite himself at even this much recognition, as long as you don't tell the others. Ralph giggled into the sand, and the expression of the pain and concentration returned to Piggy's face. Half a sec. He hastened back into the forest, and Ralph stood up and trotted back along the right. Here the beach was interrupted abruptly by a square motif of the landscape, a great platform of pink granite thrust uncompromisingly through forest and terrace and sand and lagoon to make a raised jet 4 feet high. The top of this was covered in a thin layer of soil and coarse grass and shaded with young palm trees. There was not enough soil for them to grow to any height, and when they reached perhaps 20 feet, they fell and dried, forming a crisscross pattern of trunks, very convenient to sit on. The palms that stood made a green roof, covered on the underside with a quivering tangle of reflections from the lagoon. Ralph hauled himself onto this platform, noted the coolness and shade, shut one eye, and decided that the shadows on his body were really green. He picked his way to the seaward edge of the platform and stood looking down to the water. It was clear to the bottom and bright with efflorescence of tropical weed and coral. A school of tiny glittering fish flicked hither and thither. Ralph spoke to himself, sounding the bass strings of delight. Beyond the platform, there was more encampment, some act of God, a typhoon perhaps, or the storm that had accompanied his own arrival, had banked sand inside the lagoon so much that there was a long, deep pool on the beach, with a high ledge of pink granite at the further end. Ralph had been deceived before now by the specious appearance of depth in the beach pool, and as he approached this one, prepared to be disappointed. But the island ran true to form, and the incredible pool, which clearly was only invaded by the sea at a high tide, was so deep at one end as to be dark green. Ralph inspected this whole 30 yards carefully and then plunged in. The water was warmer than his blood, and he might have been swimming in a huge bath. Piggy appeared again and sat on the rocky ledge and watched Ralph's green and white body enviously. You can't swim, Piggy. Piggy took off his shoes and ranged them carefully on the ledge and then tested the water with one toe. It's hot. What did you expect? I didn't expect nothing. My auntie. Sucks to your auntie. Ralph did a surface dive and swam under the water with his eyes open. The sandy edge of the pool loomed up like a hillside. He turned over, holding his nose, and a golden light danced and shadowed just over his face. Piggy was looking determined and began to take off his shorts. Presently, he was palely and fatly naked. He tiptoed down into the sandy side of the pool and sat there up to his neck in the water, smiling profoundly at Ralph. Aren't you going to swim? Piggy shook his head. I can't swim. I wasn't allowed. My asthma. Sucks to your asthma. So that's a really famous quote from this. Sucks to your asthma. Piggy bore this with a humble patience. You can't swim half well. And Ralph paddled backwards towards the slope, immersed his mouth and blew a jet of water in the air. Then he lifted his chin and spoke. I could swim when I was 5. Daddy taught me. He's a commander in the Navy. When he gets leave, he'll come and rescue us. Where's your father? Piggy's flushed suddenly. My dad's dead, he said quickly. And my mom. He took off his glasses and looked vainly for something in which to clean them. I used to live with my auntie. She kept a sweet shop. I used to get ever so many sweets, as many as I liked. When will your dad rescue us? Soon as he can. Piggy rose dripping from the water and stood naked, cleaning his glasses with a sock. The only sound that reached him now through the heat of the morning was the long, grinding roar of the breakers on the reef. How does he know we're here? Ralph lulled in the water. Sleep enveloped him like the swathing mirages that the wrestling and brilliance of the lagoon. How does he know we're here? Because, thought Ralph. Because. The roar from the reef became very distant. They'd tell him at the airport. Ralph shook his head and put on his flashing glasses and looked down at Ralph. Not them. Didn't you hear what the pilot said about the atom bomb? They're all dead. And so what actually happened here was we are in World War III, right? So at the time, this was only 10 years after the first nuke ever got dropped. So there was sorry. Yeah, so this is saying like World War III, right? Like a hypothetical. It's a fictional novel. Again, this is 10 years after World War II. The world just saw the devastating power of nukes, and and then they got built at mass rates in America and the USSR. Didn't you hear what the pilot said about the atom bomb? They're all dead. Ralph had pulled himself out of the water, stood facing Piggy, and considered this unusual problem. And Piggy persisted. This is an island, isn't it? I climbed a rock, said Ralph slowly, and I think this is an island. They're all dead, said Piggy. And this is an island. Nobody don't know we're here. Your dad don't know. Nobody don't know. And his lips quivered and the spectacles were dimmed with mist. We may stay here until we die. With that word, the heat seemed to increase till it became a threatening weight, and the lagoon attacked them with a blinding effulgence. Get my clothes, muttered Ralph. Along there. He trotted through the sand, enduring the sun's enmity, and crossed the platform and found his scattered clothes. To put on a gray shirt once more was strangely pleasing. Then he climbed the rock on the platform and sat in the green shade on a convenient trunk. Piggy hauled himself upwards, carrying most of his clothes under his arms. Then he sat carefully on a fallen trunk near the little cliff that fronted the lagoon, and the tangled reflections quivered over him. Presently he spoke. We've got to find the others. We've got to do something. And Ralph said nothing. Here there was a coral island, protected from the sun. Ignoring Piggy's ill-omented talk, he dreamed pleasantly. And Piggy insisted, how many of us are here? Ralph came forward and stood by Piggy. I don't know. Here and there, little breezes crept over the polished waters beneath the haze of the heat. When the breezes reached the palm fronds, would whisper, so that the spots of blurred sunlight slid over their bodies or moved like bright, winged things in the shade. Piggy looked at Ralph, and all the shadows on Ralph's face were reversed. Green above, bright for below the lagoon. A blur of sunlight was crawling across his hair. We got to do something, and Ralph looked through him. Here at last was the imagined but never fully realized place leaping into real life. Ralph's lips parted in delight, and Piggy, taking this smile to himself as a mark of reassurance, laughed with pleasure. If it really is an island, what's that? Ralph had stopped smiling, pointed down to the lagoon. Something creamy lay along the ferny weeds. A stone, no, a shell. And then suddenly Piggy was a bubble with decorous excitement. It's all right, it's a shell. I've seen one like that before, on someone's back wall, a conch, he called it. He used to blow it so that his mum would come. It's ever so valuable. Near to Ralph's elbow, a palm sapling leaned out against the lagoon. Indeed, the weight was already pulling a lump from the poor soil, and soon it would fall. He tore out a stem and began to poke about it in the water, while the brilliant fish flicked away on this side and that. Piggy leaned dangerously. Careful, you'll break it. Shut up. Ralph spoke absently, and the shell was interesting and pretty and a worthy plaything, but the vivid phantoms of this daydream still interposed between him and Piggy, who in this context was an irrelevance. The palm sapling, bending, pushed the shell across the weeds, and Ralph used one hand as a fulcrum and pressed down with the other till the shell rose, dripping, and Piggy could make a grab. Now the shell was no longer a thing seen, but not to be touched. Ralph too became excited. Piggy babbled, a conch, ever so expensive. I bet if you wanted to buy one, you'd have to pay pounds and pounds and pounds. He had it on his garden wall, and my auntie. Ralph took the shell from Piggy, and a little water ran down his arm. In color, the shell was a deep cream, touched here and there with fading pink. Between the points, worn away in a little hole, and the pink lips of the mouth lay 18 inches of shell and a little spiral twist and covered with a delicate embossed pattern. Ralph took sand out of the deep tube. Mooed like a cow, he said, and he had some white stones too, and a bird cage with a green parrot. He didn't know the white stones, of course, he said. Piggy paused for a breath and stroked the glistening thing that lay in Ralph's arms. Ralph looked up. We can use this to call the others, to have a meeting. They'll come when they hear this, he beamed at Ralph. That's what you meant, didn't you? That's why you got the conch out of the water. Ralph pushed back his fair hair. How did your friend blow into the conch? He kind of spat, said Piggy. My auntie wouldn't let me blow on account of my asthma. He said you blew from down here, and Piggy laid a hand on his jutting abdomen. You try, Ralph. You call the others. Doubtfully, Ralph laid the small end of the shell against his mouth and blew. There came a rushing sound from its mouth, but nothing more. Ralph wiped the salt water off his lips and tried again, but the shell remained silent. He kind of spat. Ralph pursed his lips and squirted air into the shell, which emitted a low farting noise. This amused both boys so much that Ralph went on squirting for some minutes between bouts of laughter. So you have to blow into this like you would a trumpet. If anyone here's ever blown into a trumpet or a trombone, it's like that. Ralph grasped the idea and hit the shell from air from his diaphragm, and immediately the thing sounded. A deep, harsh note boomed under the palms, spread through the intricacies of the forest, and echoed back from the pink granite of the mountains. Clouds of birds rose from the treetops, and something squealed and ran in the undergrowth. So this is going to sound like a foghorn, essentially. Ralph took the shell away from his lips. Gosh. His ordinary voice sounded like a whisper after the harsh note of the conch. He laid the conch against his lips, took a deep breath, and blew once more. The note boomed again, and then at a firmer pressure, the note, fluken up an octave, became a strident blare, more penetrating than before. Piggy was shouting something, his face pleased, his glasses flashing. The birds cried, small animals scuttered. Ralph's breath failed, and the note dropped to the octave and became a low wubber was a gush of air. Was a rush of air. So why don't we actually take our break here? I'm only doing it mid-chapter, but we're gonna have to because we're only halfway done. So we'll take our break here. Okay, so just continuing on here. So where we left off was he had just blown this conch shell to try and summon everyone else on the island. So we are at the top third of page 13. So the conch was silent, a gleaming tusk, and Ralph's face was dark with breathlessness, and the air over the island was full with bird clamor and the echoes ringing. I bet you can hear that for miles. And Ralph found his breath and blew in a series of short blasts, and Piggy exclaimed, "There's one." A child had appeared among the palms about 100 yards along the beach. He was perhaps a boy of 6 years old, sturdy and fair. His clothes were torn and his face covered with a sticky mess of fruit. His trousers had been lowered for an obvious purpose and had only been pulled halfway up. He jumped off the palm terrace into the sand, and his trousers fell around his ankles. He stepped out of them and trotted to the platform, and Piggy helped him up. Meanwhile, Ralph continued to blow till the voices shouted in the forest. The small boy squatted in front of Ralph and looked up brightly and vertically, and he received the reassurance of something purposely being done. He began to look satisfied, and his only clean digit, a pink thumb, slid into his mouth. Piggy leaned down to him. "What's your name?" "Johnny." Piggy muttered the name to himself and shouted it to Ralph, but he was not interested, and he was still blowing. His face was dark with the violent pleasure of making this stupendous noise, and his heart was making the stretched shirt shake. The shouting in the forest was nearer. Signs of life were now visible on the beach. The sand beneath the heat haze concealed many of the figures in its miles of length. Boys were making their way towards the platform through the hot, dumb sand. 3 small children, no older than Johnny, appeared from startlingly close at hand, where they had been gorging fruits in the forest. A dark little boy, not much younger than Piggy, parted a tangle of undergrowth, walked onto the platform, and smiled cheerfully at everybody. More and more of them came, taking their cue from the innocent Johnny. They sat down on the fallen palm trees and waited, and Ralph continued to blow short, penetrating blasts. Piggy moved among the crowd, asking names and frowning to remember them. The children gave him the same obedience that they had given to the men with the megaphones. Some were naked and carrying their clothes, others half naked or more or less dressed in school uniforms, gray, blue, fawn, jacketed or jersey. There were badges, mottos even, stripes of color in stockings and pullovers. Their heads clustered above the trunks in the green shade. Heads brown, fair, black, chestnut, sandy, and mouse-colored. Heads muttering, whispering, heads full of eyes that watched Ralph and speculated. Something was being done. The children who came along the beach, signaling or in twos, leapt into visibility when they crossed the line of the heat haze in the near sand. Here, the eye was first attracted to the black, bat-like creature that danced on the sand, and only later perceived the body above it. The bat was the child's shadow, shrunk by the vertical sun to a patch with the hurrying feet. Even while he blew, Ralph noticed that the last pair of bodies that reached the platform above a muttering patch of black. The 2 boys, bullet-headed with hair like tow, flung themselves down and lay grinning and panting at Ralph like dogs. They were twins, and the eye was shocked and incredulous with cherry duplication. They breathed together. They grinned together. They were chunky and vital. They raised wet lips at Ralph, before they seemed provided with not quite enough skin, so that the profiles were blurred and their mouths pulled open. Piggy bent his flashing glasses at them and could be heard between the blasts, repeating their names. Sam Eric. Then he got muddled. The twins shook their heads and pointed at each other, and the crowd laughed. At last, Ralph ceased to blow and sat there, the conch trailing from one hand, his head bowed on his knees. As the echoes died away, so did the laughter, and there was silence. Within the diamond haze of the beach, something dark was fumbling along. Ralph saw it first and watched till the inertness of the gaze drew all eyes that way. Then the creatures stepped from the mirage onto the clear sand, and they saw that the darkness was not all shadows, but mostly clothing. The creatures was a party of boys, marching approximately in steps of 2 parallel lines, and dressed in strangely eccentric clothing. Shorts, shirts, and different garments they carried in their hands, but each boy wore a square black cap with a silver badge in it. Their bodies, from throat to ankle, were hidden by black cloaks which bore a long silver cross on the left breast, and each neck was finished off with a ham bone frill. The heat of the tropics, the descent, the search for food, and now this sweaty march along the blazing beach had given them the complexions of newly washed plums. The boy who controlled them was dressed in the same way, though his cap badge was golden. When his party was about 10 yards away from the platform, he shouted an order, and they halted, gasping and sweating, swaying in the fierce light. The boy himself came forward, vaulted onto the platform with his cloak flying, and peered into what to him was almost complete darkness. So when this convoy here kind of comes in again, they're escorting this one guy who just jumped up there with the gold badge. It was almost ceremonial. So where's the man with the trumpet? And Ralph, sensing his sunblindness, answered him. There's no man with a trumpet, only me. Ralph came forward and peered down. The boy came forward and peered down at Ralph, screwing up his face as he did so. What he saw of the fair-haired boy with the creamy shell on his knees did not seem to satisfy him. He turned quickly, and his black cloak circling. Isn't there a ship then? Inside the floating cloak, he was a tall, thin, and bony. He was tall, thin, and bony. And his hair was red beneath the black cap. His face was crumpled and freckled and ugly without silliness. Out of his face stared 2 blue eyes, frustrated now and turning, or ready to turn to anger. Isn't there a man here? And Ralph spoke to his back. No, we're having a meeting. Come and join in. The group of cloaked boys began to scatter from the close lines, and the tall boys shouted at them, Choir, stand still. Wearily obedient, the choir huddled around the line and stood there, swaying in the sun. Nonetheless, some began to protest faintly, but Merridew, please, Merridew, can't we? So this tall boy who seems to lead this choir, his name is Merridew. Then one of the boys flopped on his face in the sand, and the line broke up. They heaved the fallen boy onto the platform and let him lie down. Merridew, his eyes staring, made the best of a bad job. All right then, sit down, leave him alone. But Merridew, he's always throwing a feint, said Merridew. He did in Gid and Addis and the Matins over the precentor. This last piece of shop brought sneakers from the choir, who perched like black birds on the crisscross trunks and examined Ralph with interest. Piggy asked no names. He was intimidated by this uniform superiority and the offhand authority in Merridew's voice. He shrank to the other side of the Ralph and busied himself with his glasses. Merridew turned to Ralph. Aren't there any grown-ups? No. Merridew sat down on a trunk and looked around the circle. Then we'll have to look after ourselves. Secure on the other side of the beach, Piggy spoke timidly. That's why Ralph made a meeting, so that we can decide what to do. We've heard names. There's Johnny, those two. They're twins. Sam and Eric. Which is Eric? You? No, you're Sam. I'm Sam, and I'm Eric. We'd better all have names, said Ralph. So I'm Ralph. We got most names, said Piggy. Got him just now. Kid's name, said Merridew. Why should I be Jack? I'm Merridew. Ralph turned to him quickly. This was the voice of one who knew his own mind. Then went on Piggy, that boy, I forget. You're talking too much, said Jack Merridew. Shut up, Fatty. And laughter arose. He's not Fatty, cried Ralph. His real name's Piggy. Piggy, Piggy, oh Piggy. And a storm of laughter arose, and even the tiniest child joined in. And for a moment, the boys were a closed circuit of sympathy. With Piggy outside. He went very pig, bowed his head, and cleaned his glasses again. So, at one point, Piggy commanded some respect. All the boys, when he was asking their name, looked at him with the same authority of this guy with the megaphone, right? Who's presumably a soldier, who's like shouting orders and stuff. They listen to that guy, and they listen to Piggy. But now, what ends up happening is everyone laughs at him, right? Because, well, his name's Piggy. Finally, the laughter died away and the naming continued. There was Maurice, next in size among the choir boys to Jack, but broad and grinning all the time. There was a slight furtive boy whom no one knew, who kept to himself with an inner intensity of avoidance and secrecy. He muttered that his name was Roger and was silent again. Bill Howard Harold, Henry, the choir boy who had fainted, sat up against the palm trunk, smiled gladly at Ralph and said that his name was Simon. Jack spoke. We've got to decide about being rescued. And there was a buzz. One of the small boys, Henry, said that he wanted to go home. Shut up, said Ralph absently. He lifted the conch. Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things. A chief. I ought to be chief, said Jack with a simple arrogance, because I'm chapster chorister and head boy. I can sing C sharp. Another buzz. Well then, said Jack. And he hesitated. The dark boy, Roger, stirred at last and spoke up. Let's have a vote. Yes, vote for a chief. Yes, let's vote. And this toy of voting was almost as pleasing as the conch. Jack started to protest, but the clamor changed from the general wish for a chief to be elected by acclaim of Ralph himself. None of the boys could have found a good reason for this. What intelligence had been shown was traceable to Piggy, while the most obvious leader was Jack. So again, we're really thinking about this. So they vote Jack in as, they vote Ralph in as leader, but Piggy's the one who's doing all the decisions, right? He's the one who's getting, hey, you should blow that conch shell and try and summon everyone. We should get names. We should get organized. No, your dad's not going to rescue us. And it seems to be that, Jack commands a lot of respect as well. And he seems to be the biggest person there. There was a stillness about Ralph as he sat that marked him out. There was his size and an attractive appearance, and most obscurely, yet most powerfully, there was the conch. That being that had blown and had sat waiting for them on the platform with a delicate thing balanced on his knees, were set apart. Hit him with the shell, Ralph, let him be chief with the trumpet thing. And Ralph raised a hand for silence. All right, who wants Jack for chief? With the dreary obedience, the choir raised their hands. And who wants me? Every hand outside the choir, except Piggy's, was raised immediately. Then Piggy, too, raised his hand grudgingly into the air. And Ralph counted, I'm chief then. And the circle of boys broke into applause. Even the choir applauded, and the freckles on Jack's face disappeared under a blush of mortification. So Jack is mortified that he's lost his vote, this vote. He started up and then changed his mind and sat down again while the air rained, and Ralph looked at him, eager to offer something. The choir belongs to you, of course. They could be the army or the hunters. They could be. The suspicion drained away from Jack's face, and Ralph waved again for silence. And Jack's in charge of the choir. They can be. What do you want them to be? Hunters. Jack and Ralph smiled at each other with shy liking. The rest began to talk eagerly. All right, choir, take off your togs. And as if released from class, the choir boy stood up, chattered, piled back their black clothes on the grass, and Jack laid his on the trunk by Ralph. His gray shorts were striking to him with sweat, and Ralph glanced at them admirably. And when Jack saw his glance, he explained, I tried to get over that hill to come and see if the water was all round, but your shell called us. And Ralph smiled and held up the conch for silence. Listen, everyone, I've got to have time to think things out. I can't decide what to do straight off. If this isn't an island, we might be rescued straight away. So we've got to decide if this is an island. Everybody must stay around here and wait and not go away. 3 of us. If we take more, we'll all get mixed up and lose each other. 3 of us will go on an expedition and find out. I'll go, and Jack, and he looked around at the circle of eager faces. There was no lack of boys to choose from, and Simon. The boys round Simon giggled, and he stood up. Laughing a little. Now that the pallor of his faint was over, he was a skinny, vivid little boy with a glance coming up from under a hut of straight hair that hung down, black and coarse. He nodded at Ralph. I'll come, and I. Jack snatched from behind him a sizable sheath knife and clouted it into the trunk, and the buzz rose and died away. Piggy stirred. I'll come. Ralph turned to him. You're no good on a job like this. All the same, we don't want you, said Jack flatly. 3's enough. And Piggy's glasses flashed. I was with him when he found the conch. I was with him before anyone else was. Jack and the others paid no attention. There was a general dispersal. Ralph, Jack, and Simon jumped off the platform and walked along the sand in the bathing pool, and Piggy hung bumbling behind them. If Simon walks in the middle of us, said Ralph, then we could talk over his head. And the three of us fell into a step. That meant that every now and then Simon had to do a double shuffle to catch up with the others. And presently Ralph stopped and looked at Piggy. Look. And Jack and Simon pretended to notice nothing. They walked on. You can't come. Piggy's glasses were misted again, this time with humiliation. You told him, after what I said, betrayal. His face flushed and his mouth trembled. After I said I didn't want. What on earth are you talking about? About being called Piggy. I said I didn't care as long as they didn't call me Piggy. And I said not to tell them. And then you went and still straight out. And stillness descended on them. Ralph, looking with more understanding at Piggy, saw that he was hurt and crushed. He hovered between the two courses of apology or further insult. Better Piggy than Fatty, he said at last, with the directness of genuine leadership. And anyways, I'm sorry if you feel like that. Now go back, Piggy, and take names. That's your job. So long. And he turned and raced towards the other two. And Piggy stood and rose with the indignation faded slowly from his cheeks. He went back to the platform. The three boys walked briskly on the sand, and the tide was low, and there was a strip of weed-strewn beach that was almost as firm as a road. The kind of glamour was spread over them, and it seemed that they were conscious of the glamour and made happy by it. They turned to each other, laughing, excited, talking, not listening. The air was bright, and Ralph, faced by this task of translating all this into an explanation, stood on his head and fell over. When they had done laughing, Simon stroked Ralph's arms shyly, and they had to laugh again. Come, said Jack presently, we're explorers. We'll go to the end of the island, said Ralph, and look around the corner, if it is an island. Now, towards the end of the afternoon, the mirages were settling a little. They found the end of the island, quite distinct and not magic out of shape or sense. There was a jumble of the usual squareness, with one great block sitting out the lagoon, and seabirds were nested there. Like icing, said Ralph, on a pink cake. We shan't see round this corner, because there isn't one, only a slow curve, and you can see the rocks get worse. And Ralph shaded his eyes and followed the jagged outline of the crags up towards the mountain. This part of the beach was nearer the mountain than any of the others that they had seen. We'll try climbing the mountain from here, he said. I should think that is the easiest way. There's less of that jungly stuff and more pink rock. Come on. The three boys began to scramble up. Some unknown force had wrenched and shattered these cubes so that they lay askew, often piled diminishingly onto each other. The most unusual feature of the rock was a pink cliff surmounted by a skewed block, and then again surmounted, and that again, till the pinkness became a stack of balanced rock projecting through the looped fantasy of the forest creepers. When the pink cliffs rose out of the ground, there were often narrow tracks winding upward. They could edge along them deep in the plant world, their faces to the rock. What made this track? And Jack paused, wiping sweat from his face, and Ralph stood by him, breathless. Men? Jack shook his head. Animals. So there's a path here, and they're saying animals made it. Ralph peered into the darkness under the trees, and the forest minutely vibrated. Come on. The difficulty was not the steep ascent around the shoulders of rock, but the occasional plunges through the undergrowth to get to the next path. Here, the roots and stems of the creepers were in such tangles that the boys had to thread through them like pliant needles. Their only guide, apart from the brown ground and occasional flashes of light through the foliage, was the tendency of the slope, whether this hill, laced as it were with cables of creepers, stood higher than that. And somehow they moved up, immured in these tangles. At perhaps their most difficult moment, Ralph turned with shining eyes to the others. Wacko, wizard, smashing. The cause of their pleasure was not obvious. All three were hot, dirty, and exhausted. Ralph was badly scratched. The creepers were as thick as their thighs and left little but tunnels for further penetration. Ralph had shouted experimentally, and they listened in these muted echoes. This is real exploring, said Jack. I bet nobody's been here before. We have to draw a map, said Ralph. Only we haven't any paper. We could make sketches on the bark, said Simon, and rub black stuff in. Again, the solemn communion of shining eyes in the gloom. Wacko wizard. There was no place for standing on one's head. This time, Ralph expressed the intensity of his emotions by pretending to knock Simon down. and as soon as they were a happy heaving pile under the dusk, in the underdusk. When they had fallen apart, Ralph spoke first. Got to get in. The pink granite of the next cliff was further back from the creepers and the trees so that they could trot up the path. This again led to more open forest so that they had a glimpse of their spread sea. With openness came the sun. It dried the sweat that had soaked their clothes in the dark, damp heat. And at last, the way to look toward this, the way to the top looked like a scramble over pink rock, with no more plunging through the darkness. The boys chose the way through defiles and over screes of sharp stone. Look, look. High over the end of the chimney, the shattered rocks lifted up their stacks and chimneys. This one, again, which Jack leaned, moved with a grating sound when they pushed. Come on. But not come on to the top. The assault on the summit must wait, while the three boys accepted this challenge. The rock was as large as a small motor car. So again, what they want to do here is they want to push a big rock over the edge. Heave, they sway back and forth, catching the rhythm. Heave and increase the swings of the pendulum. Increase, come up, bear against the point of the furthest balance. Increase, increase, and heave. The great rock loitered, posed on one toe, decided not to return, moved through the air, fell, struck, turned over, leapt droning through the air, and smashed a deep hole in the canopy of the forest. Echoes and birds flew. White and pink dust floated. The forest further down shook as with the passage of an enraged monster, and then the island was still. Waco like a bomb. Weo. Not for 5 minutes could they drag themselves away from this triumph, but they left at last. The way to the top was easy after that, and as they reached the last stretch, Ralph stopped. Golly. They were on the lip of a cirque or a half cirque on the side of the mountain. This was filled with a blue flower or rock plant of some sort and the overflow hung down the vent and spilled lavishly among the canopy of the forest. The air was thick with butterflies, lifting, fluttering, settling. Beyond the critique, the cirque was a square top of the mountain, and soon they were standing on it. They had guessed before that this was an island, clambering among the pink rocks with the sea on either side and the crystals heights in the air. They had known by some instinct that the sea lay on every side. But there seemed something more fitting in leaving the last word till they stood on the top and could see a circular horizon of waters. And Ralph turned to the others. This belongs to us. It was roughly boat-shaped, humped near this end, with behind them the jumbled descent to the shore. On either side, rocks, cliffs, treetops, and a steep slope. Forward there, the length of the boat, a tamer descent, tree-clad with hints of pink, and then the jungly flat of the island, dense green, but drawn to the end of a pink tail. There, where the island petered out into the water, was another island, rock, almost detached, standing like a fort, facing them across the green, with one bold pink bastion. The boys surveyed all of this, and then looked out to the sea. They were high up, and the afternoon had advanced. The view was not robbed of sharpness by mirage. That's a reef, a coral reef. I've seen pictures like that. The reef enclosed more than one side of the island, laying perhaps a mile out and parallel to what they now thought of as their beach. The coral was scribbled in the sea as though a giant had bent down to reproduce the image of the island in a flowing chalk line. But tired before he finished. Inside was peacock waters, rocks and weeds, showing as in an aquarium outside of the dark blue of the sea. The tide was running so that the long streaks of foam tailed away from the reef, and for a moment they felt that the boat was moving steadily astern. Jack pointed down. That's where we landed. Beyond falls and cliffs, there was a gash visible in the trees. They were the splintered trunks, and then the drag, leaving only a fringe of palm between the scar and the sea. There, too, jutting into the lagoon, was the platform with insect-like figures moving near it. Ralph sketched a twining line from the bald spot on which they stood down a slope, a gully, through flowers, round and round to the rock where the scar started. That's the quickest way back. Eyes shining, mouths open, triumphant, they savored the right of dominance. They were lifted up, were friends. There's no village smoke and no boats, said Ralph wisely. We'll make sure later, but I think it's uninhabited. We'll get food, cried Jack. Hunt, catch things, until they fetch us. Simon looked at both of them, saying nothing but nodding until his black hair flopped backwards and forwards. His face was glowing. Ralph looked down the other way from where there was no reef. Steeper, said Jack, and Ralph made a cupping gesture. That bit of forest down there, the mountain holds it up. Every cone of the mountain held up trees, forests, and trees. Now the forest stirred, roared, and flailed. The nearest acre of rock flowers fluttered, and for a half minute the breeze blew cool on their faces. And Ralph spread his arms, all ours. They laughed and tumbled and shouted on the mountain. I'm hungry. When Simon mentioned his hunger, the others became aware of theirs. Come on, said Ralph. We found out what we wanted to know. They scrambled down a rock slope, down among the flowers, and made their way under the trees. Here they paused and examined the bushes around them curiously. And Simon spoke first. Like candles, candle bushes, candle buds. The bushes were dark evergreen and aromatic, and the many buds were waxing green and folded up against the light. Jack slashed at one with his knife, and the scent spilled all over. Candle buds. You couldn't light them, said Ralph. They look just like candles. Green candles, said Jack contemptuously. We can't eat them. Come on. They were in the beginning of the thick forest, plonking with weary feet on the track when they heard the noise, squeakings, and the hard strike of hoofs on a path. As they pushed forward towards the squeaking as they pushed forward, the squeaking increased until it became a frenzy. They found a piglet caught in the curtain of creepers, throwing itself at the elastic traces in the madness of extreme terror. Its voice was thin, needle-sharp, and incessant. The three boys rushed forward, and Jack drew his knife again with a flourish. So they found a trapped piggy, and Jack draws his knife. He raised his arms in the air, but then came a pause, a hiatus. The pig continued to scream, and the creepers to jerk, and the blade continued to flash at the end of a bony arm. The pause was only long enough for them to understand what an enormity the downward stroke would be. What an enormity the downward stroke would be, right? It's enormous because it's killing it. Then the piglet tore loose from the creepers and scurried into the undergrowth. They were left looking at each other in their place of terror, and Jack's face was white under the freckles. He had noticed he still held the knife aloft and brought his arm down, replacing the blade in the sheath. Then all three laughed ashamedly and began to climb back to the trap. I was choosing a place, said Jack. I was waiting for the moment to decide where to strike him. You should stick a pig, said Ralph fiercely. They always talk about sticking a pig. You cut a pig's throat to let the blood out, said Jack. Otherwise you can't eat the meat. Why didn't you? They knew very well why he hadn't. Because of the enormity of the knife descending and cut it into living flesh. Because of the unbearable blood. I was going to, said Jack. He was ahead of them, and they could not see his face. I was choosing a place next time. He snatched his knife out from under the sheet and slammed it into a tree trunk. Next time, there would be no mercy. He looked around fiercely, daring them to contradict. Then they broke out into the sunlight and they moved, and for a while they were busy finding and devouring food as they moved through the scar towards the platform and the meeting.
Was that Jack?
The Jack,
the one who didn't want to kill them.
He was the one who, had the knife raised, was about to kill it, and paused just long enough for it to get away. And so that is an important moment that we will end up looking back on. The key moments I really want to highlight here is Piggy's treatment and how they decided the leader and this knife incident. Those are the three real big ones of this chapter that will get discussed later. Okay. So first off, as you guys, again, as I said, this guy talks a lot about the island and what things look like. Not a lot of that is immensely important. So you don't need to worry about, like, if you took ELA 30 with me, this is not a landscape thing. You do not need to worry about what the island looks like. Like I said, I like doing things in booklets. I think it just makes it a little bit easier. Give me 1 second, let me load my stuff up. So there's a couple things here. We do have a character list because it's Friday. We're gonna skip this. We'll come back to this on Monday. I feel like that'll be a good reminder of some stuff. The three big characters here, just as a heads up, are Ralph, Jack, and Piggy. The other characters are important as well, but those are the big three. There's also some symbols as well. Like the conch, for example, is going to symbolize something. I like doing plot summaries, which we will do. Yeah, let's just do that now. Why not? While it's fresh in our heads. So again, this is just meant to be it's meant to just help us remember. We'll go over the main things here. So what we know is that they woke up. You're gonna have to write small, I apologize. They woke up on a deserted island. You know, it's World War III, they're dropping atom bombs, all this stuff like that. So we have Ralph and Piggy who find the conch, that big shell. So they use this conch to call the others. So they call the others. Ralph is voted chief and embarrasses Piggy and Jack. They're embarrassed for different reasons, but they embarrasses them both. And so then they discover it's an island. And of course, one thing is there's the Jack doesn't kill the pig. They kind of highlight it. So that's like our plot summary. A couple of other important events though is that Piggy is seems to be smart. He's making good decisions. So Piggy seems to be making good decisions. Jack leads the choir. So Jack, like outside of the island, he literally was a choir boy. He led it, like it's a literal choir, the singing choir. And finally, one other important thing here is everyone just seems to be having fun with it. It's a big joke to them, right? They're going up around this island to make sure it's an island, make sure if there's people here, is there any way they can get rescued? And they stop for like 10 minutes because they had to push a boulder over. And they could laugh and like, oh my God, there's no adults, it's all ours. So the whole thing, they're abandoned on an island is not taken seriously.
Probably push the ball there.
Everyone has that, okay. Like I said, we'll do the characters later, we'll talk about the themes later. So we got about a half hour here. We don't have enough time to go through another chapter. So instead, what I'll have you guys do is there's a couple questions here that you guys are able to start working towards. Yeah, I think that's the only thing we really. 1 second. Yeah, so this is the only real thing that we'll spend some time doing here. We might end up talking about it today. We'll see. I want to give you guys enough time, and I know that some of you are still working on the thing from night, so it'll probably just be this, to be fair. And if you are still working on night, my suggestion is try and like finish that up this weekend if you can. It's going to be hard if you're juggling both those books.